happy to be here today. I'm going to talk a bit about Sundance Harvest because that's primarily my largest body of work that I feel like many people know me from. And then I'll talk about some of my side projects. So I'm Cheyenne Sundance, and I run Sundance Harvest, which is a year-round farm in Toronto. It operates out of Downsview Park. Sundance Harvest is solely operated and owned by myself. I specialize in really growing a mixture of things. So in the fall and winter months, I grow salad greens such as kale, arugula, herbs, all that stuff. In the summer, I grow fruiting crops. Sundance Harvest really is, I would say, like a food justice farm because I do center education for those who are most affected by colonialism, food insecurity, and also food injustices. So Sundance Harvest, when I do hire staff, I do really prioritize Black and Indigenous youth because they face the highest rates of food insecurity across Canada. And with Sundance Harvest, I really wanted it to be a model and even a pilot project or even a pilot urban farm that could really show folks who are part of these demographics who face the highest rates of food insecurity across Canada, ways that we can be represented in agriculture and also urban agriculture. So that's a bit about Sundance Harvest. I'm expanding, which is great. And I always hire and always pay a living wage, which is also very beneficial. I also run 2 other projects. So the other project I run is called Liberating Lawns. So what that is, it is actually sprung out of COVID. It's a yard sharing project where folks who have land, and they're called landholders, not landowners because we live in a settler state called Canada. And then growers get matched up together. And what they get to do is actually the growers get to grow food in a yard that otherwise would have had grass. And then the landholders get a share of produce, which is really cool. And I have about 20 or 30 matches so far, which is really great. Folks are doing that. And then I also have one last project, which is actually very partnered with Sundance Harvest, which is actually called Growing in the Margins. So all of my education, all the work I really put toward providing free education for marginalized youth, who are primarily Black, Indigenous, persons of color, queer, trans, and Two-Spirit. I actually have a weekly garden for these youth that they come and visit each week, and they get free education on farming and growing food because all those groups are actually underrepresented. So when we're really thinking about who we're seeing as a farmer, it's very, very far off than not BIPOC femmes, BIPOC queer folks, and trans folks. So really having Growing in the Margins, having a weekly garden, having a group that's anti-oppressive and supportive of these youth is actually providing an opportunity for them to get their foot in the door for urban ag. And if they get their foot in the door for urban ag, then they can actually start maybe getting more aware of the environment and biodiversity, and also different ways they can be one with earth. And I feel like that's a really important thing. Growing in the Margins, I would say, is like a really big success because every year, at least 5 youth actually get jobs within urban ag the following year. And this is simply what I actually think it's because of representation. I'm teaching the youth. I'm a BIPOC woman. I'm a young BIPOC woman who's 23 years old, teaching these youth, right? And they're seeing me farming and seeing me have a career out of it. So then therefore they can see themselves having a career out of it. And I feel like that's a pretty cool thing when you think about it. But I've spoken about a couple words so far, and I wanted to clarify. So food justice. So when I say Sundance Harvest is a food justice farm, food justice in its terminology basically means a theory and an action and really a change to dismantle oppressive food systems and also understand that some people have access to food and some people don't. And really with food justice is kind of different than food security because food justice looks at those oppressive systems such as colonialism and racism that actually oppress folks who would actually get fresh produce, but because of otherwise those systems, they cannot. So I would say food justice is really paramount when you're thinking about food. Not everyone has access to intergenerational wealth and land. Not everyone can just go up to their parents' cottage and just become a farmer. A lot of people, a lot of low-income people, especially Black and Indigenous people, have a long history with the land that is sometimes painful. So it's very important to recognize that when we're thinking about food and growing food and also land. And then I would say the last part I'll probably chime in to talk about is like what a resilient food system really looks like. So I do urban agriculture. I've also farmed rurally for a while. I used to farm in Cuba when I was 18. And I started Sundance Harvest when I was, I think, 21. So growing food in the city, a lot of times people say, oh, well, that's more like gardening. I would say it's actually the opposite. Sundance Harvest produces enough food for about 50 families a week in a very small space, and doing it in an ecological way that respects the nature and the environment and also the waterways, because I really don't spray many pesticides. I have ladybugs, I have grasshoppers, I have all that stuff in my greenhouse. So I would say that, like, thinking about resilient food system and also thinking about our local food system in Ontario as a whole, urban agriculture is a central part of that, because the very large concentration of people live in Toronto. So if we don't have a resilient food system, I think that translates into not having good agriculture. So having good policy that advocates for agriculture and more green spaces where you can grow food is a big thing. And another thing, though, I've noticed from my years of growing food and doing advocacy work in urban ag, is that ultimately youth like myself want to have jobs in urban ag. So if they find out that the only really way they can be involved in urban ag is maybe through nonprofits or volunteer works, oftentimes they won't do it because people still have to pay their MetroPass, their hydro bills. So that is also one of the pitfalls of capitalism. But in itself, it's very important to note that, like, within urban ag in Toronto, youth can have jobs. It creates more employment. And then, of course, the final piece I feel like everyone knows, it actually helps the environment. It helps people become more aware of where their food is coming from, who's growing their food. And it can also help with issues such as migrant workers' rights. A lot of youth that grow food with me are now very passionate about these issues because they're therefore more connected to the land, and they have more respect for food and land and where that food really comes from. So I would say those are some of the key points with growing food and the work I do. I would say that it's like very, I feel like, beneficial and great. And yeah, I would say that's about it. I can really talk about with Sundance Harvest, but I'm more than happy to answer really any Q&As. Sundance Harvest, like I said, is more of a food justice farm. So I wouldn't say it's like an overall like ecological farm as it is, but it's a bit more than that.